Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to today's Human Capital Watch webcast. My name is Amy Yi. I'm the researcher in the Human Capital Center by the Conference Board. I'm very delighted that you can join us today to get a preview of our upcoming research on taking diversity and inclusion global. So today, many multinational organizations are facing important talent challenges, including how to manage diversity and inclusion across different regions and countries. So taking DNI global actually requires organizations not only align complex enterprise-level strategic priorities, but also adapt them to local needs and contexts. So how can organizations achieve both the global alignment as well as the local flexibility is the focus of today's webcast. So now let's look at some of the critical issues we will be addressing today. So we have three key questions to address today. The first is, what are the critical factors organizations can consider when taking diversity and inclusion global? The second one is, how can organizations foster strong relationships between enterprise-level DNI and regional stakeholders? More specifically, what's the role of DNI leaders in this process, and what local resources can organizations leverage to ensure taking diversity and inclusion global successfully? And last but not least, how can organizations track progress and ensure effectiveness of DNI global and local initiatives? So today's webcast will be really interactive as we created a handful of poll questions for you to respond to. So these questions actually derived from the key findings from our research, which will help us to understand where your organization is in the journey of taking DNI global. So we're really looking forward to hear your perspectives and experiences in taking DNI global. But before we address these questions on the slide, I want to go over a few details to help you better participate in today's webcast. So first of all, those of you who have been following Human Capital Watch for some time, you probably noticed that my background is slightly different today. Because of COVID-19, we are all encouraged to work remotely. So this is actually the first webcast, and everyone, including the researchers, myself, as well as my colleagues in the digital media team, who support today's webcast, actually, they're all virtual. So we are prepared, and we trying really hard to ensure you have a wonderful webcast experience. But just in case there are some small technical glitches in the next 60 minutes, I want to apologize in advance for those, and thank you for your patience and understanding. And I'd like to encourage you to actively engage in the conversations. I know we have the poll questions, but we also encourage you to type your questions and comments in the chat box, and we will be monitoring your comments throughout the webcast and try to address them during our discussions. And you can download the presentations. The link is at the bottom of your screen. To make the screen larger, you can click the 4 arrows at the top right-hand corner of the screen. There will be a brief evaluation at the end of today's presentation. It will take you only about 1 to 2 minutes to complete. So please do take a moment and let us know how we can improve going forward. And this webcast will be made available on demand following today's presentation, and you can access it anytime on the Conference Board website, and feel free to share it with your colleagues who might be interested in today's topic. So we will also be offering CEU credits to participants. So we offer 3 types of credits: HRCI, SHRM, and CPE. Please keep in mind you have to stay online for the entire webcast because credits will be only made available for participation in the live webcast. So for those of you who request these credits, please enter your name, email address, and type of credits you need in the box on the lower right side of the screen. If you are interested in CPE credits, You will also need to respond to 3 pop-ups throughout the presentation today, so please look out for those. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our 2 panelists today. So we have 2 guest speakers today. The first is Marianne Devine. Marianne is Senior Researcher in the Human Capital Center Europe. Hi, Marianne. Glad you can join us today.
Thank you, Amy. Hi.
Hi. We also have Laura Sabatini, who's a Principal Researcher in the Human Capital Center US, also from the Conference Board. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you. Hello, everyone.
Hi. So before we jump into the poll questions and also share our research findings, I'd like to invite Laura first to give us a quick overview of the study and also share some key definitions. I think it'll be really helpful for our audience to get some context of the study.
Yes, thank you, Amy. And I'll start with a very general definition. Amy has already provided a lot of great context for our study that we're going to talk about today. I just wanted to set up the definition, if you will, of diversity and inclusion in the context of these particular research. I know that you all know what diversity and inclusion is, but what we ask participants in these studies is to think about their strategy, policies, and programs, encouraging both representation and participation of workers and employees across the organization. So we wanted to make sure that we understood that balancing act that Amy mentioned around taking diversity and inclusion global, both in terms of potential representation metrics and goals related to increasing diversity, but also, and most importantly, to understand the inclusion elements, as we know that in an inclusive culture, diversity thrives in an inclusive culture. And so we really wanted to make sure to understand both factors and how organizations go about translating those across regions, businesses, offices, and so on. So as Amy mentioned, taking DNI Global was defined as really understanding this alignment of the global strategy and customization at the local level. So now thinking about what we asked our participants, and I'm going to go over the methodology in a second, but I wanted to give you a sense of the kind of questions we asked to understand how organizations achieve alignment and flexibility in their strategies. So we asked participants to tell us how their organizations conceptualize and define diversity and inclusion across businesses and regions. So how do you translate even the notions and definitions of diversity and inclusion? And do you translate them or do you create those definitions? So we'll go over those insights. We also asked participants to tell us about the priorities and strategies. So one is the definition, the other one is the goals that you want to achieve with your diversity and inclusion strategy. So how do you decide, for example, what gender goals you might have in one region versus the other? How do you make sure that the local stakeholders chime in and provide their insights about what's happening in their regions? So those are some of the questions from our interviews. Last but not least, as Amy mentioned, we wanted to understand measurements, but we also wanted to understand if companies might be using specific tools to make these decisions. So we wanted to ask about how they track the results, but also are there particular types of tools that are helping you making those decisions. So how do we get to these insights that you'll hear about today? So this is, I should mention up front, this is a strictly qualitative methodology. We did a literature review that included both research literature as well as best practices and initiatives. And we interviewed 12 DNI executives with global responsibilities, including responsibilities to take diversity and inclusion global. So these leaders came from a variety of industries. We had pharma, financial, manufacturing, food. So we had different industries, and we also made sure to interview both leaders that had a fairly established and even a fairly big team helping them taking diversity and inclusion global, but we also interviewed leaders that might be the sole person taking diversity and inclusion, and maybe they just started the diversity journey. So we wanted to get a range of perspectives on what organizations do. In addition to our interviews, we asked for insights from diversity and inclusion councils here at the conference board. These are groups of senior executives that are selected, that have specific titles, in this case related to diversity and inclusion, and meet on a regular basis to discuss the issues that they deal with in their organizations. And so we ask feedback for both Europe and US councils for a total of about 30 organizations. And then we also engage other stakeholders from the conference board, including our Global Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Board, who helps us select key topics in this area. And again, this is just to give you a sense of where our insights come from. And as Amy said, we're going to try to make this very interactive so that you can contribute, your perspectives and your experience with what we found in our analysis. Amy, I think you're on mute.
I'm sorry, yeah. So thank you, Laura, for the thorough overview of the research methodology and questions. So let's look at the first two poll questions together. So the two questions are actually in parallel. The first question is about, does your organization have an enterprise-wide definition of workforce diversity tailored to your business? And similarly, the second question is also asking about enterprise-wide definition, but this time we are asking about definition of workplace inclusion. So we have 5 options: yes, no, I don't know, we are working on it, I wish. We will give participants about 10 seconds to respond to these questions. So Laura, Marianne, we're seeing the responses coming in. Any surprises?
Not so far. Actually, I think that there are a lot more definitions that we might have found. We had a little bit of 50-50 of official enterprise-wide definitions in our sample. What do you think, Marianne?
Yeah, I mean, I think those results are very encouraging because I think the work we did last year on defining and measuring inclusion just says it's very important that you do have definitions tailored to your business that make sense to you. So that's a really good result to see that.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Great.
So
let's close the poll now.
And
great. Yeah.
And Amy, if you'd move on to the next slide, I think this leads us to our first sort of insight. Is just as important the clear and consistent DNI definitions and priorities. And I think that sometimes that can be easy to overlook almost. And as I said, we did some work last year on defining and measuring inclusion. And we found that it's really important for companies to have definitions of DNI that is really understood. Because when you start probing and drilling down, actually, sometimes people don't understand it, and more so than you would think. And it's a really important sort of framework to ensure that everybody is speaking the same language around diversity and inclusion, and that the focus is therefore on sort of those shared values and those behaviours. And the trick is about that they have to be consistent globally, but they do have to be meaningful at the local level. This is not easy in a big company. So, for example, one of the largest companies that we spoke to, 120,000 employees, and it has either subsidiaries or joint ventures in 80 countries. That just gives you some sort of sense of actually getting that clear framework in place is really important and not to be overlooked. Looking at the next slide, I think that the point about a clear, wide definition of diversity and inclusion is just that they do, once you've got that in place, it can really be helpful to help you sort of really make a case of why DNI is important to the organisation. For example, for you it might be around well-being, for another company it might be around innovation. So to get that sort of sense of the business priority is very, very important. And it helps you to scope your efforts in building inclusive cultures, and that can then help point to important leadership skills that you need to nurture that inclusive culture. Last year in our C-Suite Challenge, I think just to flag up to you that we did ask a question about what are the top traits of an inclusive organisation. we saw some really fascinating differences across the countries and the regions around the world. And it was very interesting that inclusiveness in Japan means transparency, so sharing of information. And actually creating a sense of belonging was down 10th place. But that was the top for China, Latin America, and Europe. So there are some nuances, but it's a very good idea, wise idea to look into a bit deeper and not necessarily assume that you know that everybody has got that same sense of understanding. And I think as well our previous research showed that if you do take that time, creating an enterprise-wide definition of DNI can actually in itself be a very inclusive process.
Great. Thanks, Marianne. And Marianne just talked about the importance of clear and consistent definitions as well as understanding the importance of DNI for the organization. So now let's take a quick look at the next poll question. So this question is about how much variation do you see in different regions and business understanding of why DNI is important for your organization. We have a couple different options. Regions and business vary a lot, good amount of variation across regions and business, some variation overall, mostly consistent, very little variation, no variation. Everyone understand that? No variation, nobody understand that. Okay, we'll give 10 seconds to respond. Laura, I think you are on mute probably.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, great.
Yes.
We're getting used to this new system. So yes, I was saying that it's also fairly consistent. So we see a lot of people sort of falling in their variation, but mostly consistent, which is good. It's a good starting point for taking diversity and inclusion global, as you can focus on the areas where maybe there's more variations in terms of customization, while still keeping an overall understanding that and language that is consistent. And so we're going to discuss some of this in a bit.
Great. Let's look at the results now. So
yes, so we have about yes, about 50% some variations. There's also about 10% of people who see a lot of variations across their regions, and so definitely I would encourage you, like if you want to use the chat room at the bottom to kind of provide more context. We're going to try to engage you in a conversation and answer your questions as we go along too. And there's a few where they see fewer variations. So so this is very helpful, and so in the next slide we're going to discuss a little bit what we saw in our sample. So, and this is delving a little deeper into what Marianne has already mentioned. So we, as you know, we had asked our sample about priorities and related to both diversity and inclusion. And we found that the leaders we interviewed would really identify two areas as they defined their priorities and global priorities. They looked at the what, and those are, if you will, some more traditional goals related to diversity and inclusion. So these are representation goals or advancement goals. What we found in terms of the global priorities, large majority, I would say probably all of our interviews had gender at the very top when it comes to global. And that's something that I should mention. It's consistent across all our research on diversity and inclusion, where gender is still a very common priority for global organizations. It's easier to measure. It's sort of consistent across regions. But we also found that many leaders had common priorities across regions related to age and generation, geographic location, of course, and nationality. There's priorities that were more regional in nature, and this means that our interviewees told us that these were priorities that might be unique and specific to a particular region. So for example, race ethnicity tends to be in North America, where that's a dimension that can be tracked, and that same dimension may take a different shape in Europe. It could be nationality, it could be a national origin. LGBTQ is also a dimension that takes different shapes in different regions, and we heard as we'll discuss later, that many organizations may have challenges translating LGBTQ priorities across regions, depending on level of awareness and also depending on legal aspects in different countries. So the what, gives us a little bit a sense of the numeric and representation metrics that many organizations have. The second area, though, that we heard a lot in our study has to do with the how. And by how it means, okay, how do you achieve those global priorities? And so those are the priorities that are to do with building an inclusive workplace where everybody can thrive and that allows you to make the best out of that diversity that you have built or can help you achieve that diversity. And even in this, we heard some consistency in terms of how organizations go about creating priorities for the how. So it's familiar, many organizations have unconscious bias training or implementation. We heard about building inclusive leadership skills for leaders so that they can drive the other priorities. We heard about communication efforts to make sure that everybody was included and could participate, as well as processes to help prevent bias in people decision-making such as hiring, succession planning, promotional opportunities. So again, when we're thinking about the definition that Marion just described, creating definitions that help the organization understand what diversity and inclusion means for your company, and then looking using those definitions to help define the what and the how. And again, our interviewees really found that this process can be a great way to start a way to take diversity and inclusion global because it provides an anchor, if you will, to then move forward in their process.
Right, thank you, Laura. So I think the other thing that we mentioned, if Amy you move the slide, is about that in terms of this process of these definitions and these priorities, there were also, we found our interviewees talked about some important external considerations that really do have a factor. So for a global organization, you have to bear these in mind. Obviously, regional demographic trends are very important. They have a big impact. And so, for example, in one company, there was a very stark example where in Asia Pacific, they had increasing numbers of young people moving into leadership roles. And so in that area of the world, they were really shifting their focus on attention to new ways of working, to be very inclusive, more flexible career paths, to be geared towards these younger workers. But in Europe, they had an aging workforce, and so the focus for DNI was very much around corporate health management programs, ergonomics, thinking about the needs of older workers. So that was a very sort of stark contrast based on the demographic trends. There are other things like country-specific regulations and legislative requirements. I'm sure you all are aware of these in your own regions, but they can make a very, very big impact. And there can be an important national initiative going on that you as an international company feel you need to support. For example, it might be to get older workers, mature workers into the workforce, or it might be something around violence against women. So it's something that's really important at a national level that you want to get involved in. And then, of course, there are country-specific cultural norms, and these, again, come into play. And sometimes companies have to tread this very fine line between defining and selecting what they see as their enterprise-wide priorities, but also being aware that there are cultural norms and beliefs that they need to think about and to decide how best to navigate around or to engage with. And at one simple level, it can be very basic. For example, in some countries, it was mentioned to us, women aren't allowed to work night shifts or to travel alone. And that limits their opportunities to obtain special jobs. And of course, there are some much bigger issues around gender and around sexuality. But that these things need to be considered and factored in when you're getting this balance between global and local. And moving on to the next slide as well, we found internal considerations, and these also need to be looked at because they will, again, really be important in some of those decisions that you make. So something that people spoke to us about was buy-in. It can vary across a global organization. It can vary even within one region or even within one business. So the sort of socialization of DNI priorities has to be an ongoing process. You're never there. You have to keep working at it and not making assumptions. So, for example, in one global company, the head of the global head of DNI sort of said, actually, some of our senior managers, some of our very senior leaders, it wasn't they hadn't bought into it, but they had questions, and we actually really needed to create a forum, a kind of safe place for them to voice some of these things that they really felt that they couldn't say openly. So it's important sort of not to make assumptions there, really. Also, you have to sort of ask, are we aligning DNI and business priorities effectively? Because again, you know that your businesses can have some very clear needs in the DNI space. So for example, in one of our companies that we interviewed, a global logistics company, the IT DNI strategy, the IT technology sort of division's DNI strategy was really around getting more women into technology roles, and they were growing significantly. So they had a set of needs, whereas there was another company that's at a different stage in the business cycle, it wasn't growing, and they were looking really much more at career development and internal mobility. So again, you have to think about the business priorities. There is the practical thing about data. We know, again, especially through all the work that's been done now on regulations and data protection and privacy, that there is a great variety around the world about, first of all, data regulations and HR systems. So there can be a big difference about what you can track consistently across your businesses and regions. And then finally, we also had the very pragmatic, well, what is the most pressing need? Actually, the pressing need that we really need to respond to now. And it could be to head off some sort of corporate, risk to your reputation, or there's an area of your enterprise that's really struggling. So those internal and external considerations all have to be weighed up when you are creating a globally consistent strategy, but that is locally responsive.
Great. Thanks, Marian. Definitely, it's really important to take in both external and internal factors into consideration when organizations develop DNI priorities. And I think I saw a question coming from one of our participants regarding mental health. So thanks, Laura, for responding to that question. Definitely, mental health has been joining more attention from more and more organizations. So now let's move on to our next poll question. So we discussed the global priorities and local priorities. So we'd like to ask you, what is the most challenging area of DNI for a global organization to translate and implement across different business regions and across different business regions? So based on your experience, if you are not working in a global organization, think about your past experience, or think about your experience translating initiatives into local areas within the country, across different functions.
And as the responses come in, I should mention that one of the things that we found in our interviews is that sometimes, even though the title of this report is taking DNI Global, sometimes some of these practices and processes can be helpful even with an organization that has different offices in different parts of the same countries or different businesses. You may have a sales function that has challenges that are different from different functions. And so some of the same processes that we're discussing can be translated there. And by looking at the responses, we see already, fairly consistent LGBTQ and race, ethnicity, and come up as fairly some of the most challenges to translate, which is what we found too. Marian and Amy, let me know if you want to add anything, but it's definitely consistent with what we found in our interviews. And we're going to discuss a little bit solutions, mainly in terms of figuring out how to best address these difficult dimensions, or difficult to translate, I should say, dimensions.
Yeah, I mean, shall we move on to the next slide? Is that all right?
I don't know if the poll questions were going to. Okay, yes.
Yeah. So I think this is one of the areas that personally I found is really interesting. The fact that we like to think that everything can be neat and everything can be drawn in an organisational chart, but actually this whole area of global and local could be described as quite messy, because there is this, where they intersect, where the local and the global intersect, there has to be a degree of negotiation, discussion, horse trading, compromises, and this is a really important, it's a reality, and it's just part and parcel of what this whole thing is about. So, for example, one of our councils talked about, well, what are some of these messy bits? And so, for example, one example of a very large company was they're saying that, you know, when you talk about, for example, regions, well, actually, when we looked into the Gulf states, 90% of the people there in some Gulf states are not nationals. And so some of the efforts and initiatives around increasing your talent in that area, you have to take into account that an awful lot of the people in the company were actual expats. And in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the priority is to increase women in the workplace. But they also have to look at things like being Sharia compliant. The employment of people with disabilities for that company was a priority in Qatar. But in the UAE, the priority was equalising access to public holidays for non-Muslims. That was just in one company. So I think that when you start drilling down, you start seeing that there's an awful lot that kind of is a bit ambiguous and you could call messy. But I think that what's become clear to us when we've talked in this qualitative research is that actually the messy bit is a challenge, but it's also an opportunity to have a really rich exchange. Yes, it takes time and yes, it takes effort, but you can have a rich conversation across and between the global business. You can get some much deeper insights into the subtleties of culture, attitudes, cultural norms and assumptions. And this can be a process that can connect people. You can learn from this exchange. It can help inform cultural training, even customer insights. So it is hard, it requires time and effort, but if you really want to make the most of diversity in all its form, if you really do want to build inclusive cultures and workplaces, if you want to get a global strategy that has this balance between local and global, then you need to use this messy space. You can think it's chaos and desirable, but actually it's more like it's complex. It is complex, but it's well worth delving into. So I think that's one of a message that I really came away from in this research.
Yep.
Great. Yeah, and I think I saw a question regarding elaborating on the top-down approach that Marianne just mentioned. I think we'll be discussing that in a minute.
Yep.
But before we do that, we have a poll question again. So when it comes to diversity inclusion efforts, how strong is the partnership between global and local within your organization? So strong, partnership, okay, weak. What is partnership? And does not apply. We only operate in one region.
So we see, and yes, and to answer to meet your question about top-down, we're going to discuss how, regardless of you know, the strategy, whether it comes from sort of the hub and the senior leaders from the organizations, or comes sometimes bottom up from the people on the ground, the one common approach that seems to be effective is building those partnerships in a way that makes sense with the culture and within the organization. So after this poll, we're going to discuss that in a bit more detail. But looking at the responses now, we see that actually almost half of you have good partnerships for some region, not all, which is of course common, and some of you are doing really well. You have a strong partnerships among all the regions. So for those of you with strong partnerships, if you have tips to share with other people here listening, feel free to to add some comments to the board. We really want to engage everyone into this discussion. And some of you are still working on it, so hopefully this webcast will help you sort of gain some insights on how to go about building those partnerships. And so, and that next slide speaks to that. This is our second insight, and if I can go back to reading the insight, it's that what we found from our interviews is that strong partnerships between enterprise level, DNI, and regional stakeholders is what really helps drive ownership on the ground, again, regardless of what the structure of the organization. It's something that was mentioned by everyone who we spoke with. So how do you do that? We have just very quick. This is just sort of a visual aid to speak about this building the connection. So we identified, many spoke about having a hub, which can be your headquarters, your DNI team, your global DNI team, regardless of where they sit. And sorry, at some point there we go. And then they had also the spokes that can mean different things in different organizations. So part of the definition process for your organization might be to really understand who the spokes are, right? So especially if you have a top-down approach to diversity and inclusion, you still want to engage those stakeholders to give them a sense of ownership. And here we have just a few examples of what we heard in our interviews. It can be business divisions, leaders, it can be regions, it can be departments. And so we're going to go into this a little bit more in detail in the next slide. But I guess we have more poll questions for now.
Yes. So we have two questions. The first one is, so they are kind of similar, but the first one is, how often do you engage your regional offices and local stakeholders to discuss global DNI priorities, goals, and or initiatives? So it's more about involving them in the conversations. And the second one is more about seeking input. So do your regional offices and local stakeholders provide input into regional DNI priorities and goals?
Yeah.
So we will give participants a few seconds to respond.
Yeah, and this was, again, to get a sense about the back and forth and the communications that might have, right? So thinking of the figure that we just showed that has the hub and the spokes, and those arrows in between the hub and the spokes, how does that work? And that impacts both the frequency of the communication as well as the extent to which regions may be able to provide input for particular priorities, right? So one of the things that we heard and that we're going to discuss later today too is that sometimes you have to understand what's negotiable and not negotiable in terms of priorities, but definitely getting feedback into those definitions, those priorities can be a helpful way to engage everyone in different areas. So any comments about this finding? We see about a lot of frequency of communication, I would say, in this group.
Yeah, I'm amazed to see that about a quarter of participants communicate at least once a month.
Yeah, so that's incredibly helpful and definitely a best practice here. And then also we see that many of you do include regional stakeholders in defining priorities. And for those of you who it's not consistent, maybe it's a question of identify, okay, why is it inconsistent? What are some of the challenges of doing that? And as we speak a little bit about tools later on, maybe some of that will be helpful. So moving to the next slide. And this is really quickly, we already mentioned this. The one area for diversity and inclusion leaders, regardless if it's just you or you have a great global team, is sort of build those strong relationships. Again, it seems like a simple idea, but the leaders we spoke with emphasize how sometimes that may not be a priority, and it can be actually key to achieving the results. So a quote from our interview says, find and cultivate relationships with local champions. You will need them both to support and inform the global strategy. And we're going to discuss a couple of strategies around that in a second. Oops.
Yeah, so I think we will just touch on the role of DNI executives. And again, I think that this is probably very important to those of you in top leadership roles for DNI. Effective DNI leadership relies on relationship building and influencing rather than enforcing. And looking at the next slide, I mean, this was a very, very strong message that came out of our interviewees. It is really important to be an influencer. You can't be an enforcer to get this enterprise-wide commitment and enterprise-wide flexible strategy. So it is about managing multiple stakeholder relationships, all the way from senior executives and leaders of the business in the regions to employees on the ground, and influencing people in different countries and cultures and at different levels of the organisation is something that is requires sophisticated skills, most definitely. And so it's also about influencing across levels, up, down and across departments, regions. You can't mandate. So I think that was a really, really important thing. And of course it's this thing of listening as well and coaching. So the DNI leaders said to us, you know, not only are you kind of communicating, but you may well be coaching individual leaders or leadership teams. And I think something that was interesting, I attended our European DNI Council very recently. There was a lot of agreement on this point, but we also had someone from Corn Ferry who had just done their 2020 research into best-in-class DNI heads of DNI, chief diversity officers, and something that came out for them was very similar to our findings, that they said that these best-in-class individuals scored much higher than their peers on social leadership traits, and in particular composure, sociability, which they meant engagement with others, and affiliation, i.e. aligning everybody towards a common goal, and also tolerating ambiguity. And I think this tolerance of ambiguity, again, really resonates with our research and the fact that you do have this sort of messy bit in the middle. So heads of DNI need to really be tolerant of ambiguity, and they need to be able to be very responsive to changes in business context. What's happening right now is an absolute classic example of that. You know, tremendous change in the business context and ambiguity in how different stakeholders are understanding and interpreting diversity and inclusion. So I think that this is something that's really important. And I do think, looking to the future, that these traits that DNI executives are developing will actually be really, really helpful as companies are going towards much more networked and flatter structures. So I think these skills could really put DNI leaders in a very good position as we go forward into the future.
Absolutely, yeah. It's important for DNI leaders to have strong influencing and coaching skills and collaborate well with each other, with others. So as we talk about DNI leadership and stakeholders, so we want to understand who drives DNI initiatives in your organizations at the local level, and do local DNI staff, champions, and or other stakeholders communicate with each other across regions? So we want to know whether it's mostly HR or business function leaders or even local groups like employee groups, councils.
Yeah, this is a good and it's interesting, we actually did have a couple of leaders saying, you know, anyone who can help is welcome to participate. So it's good to see that in the case of the people listening, there's a little bit more structure, but it's still a good variation of roles. And let's see, and also it's a good, about 40%, maybe a little less now, but it seems like a good group of people also have regular communications across the regions, which is definitely something that emerges key in our study as well. Any other things from the poll questions, Amy or Marian?
Yeah, we see that some people pick the mostly local employee groups and councils.
Yep. Yes, definitely. So no, this is really helpful, and again, it seems like there's also a good proportion, you know, that has many different leaders and stakeholders, which is a little bit what we find, you know, when we go to the next insights. There's to build on what Marian just discussed about the role that the DNI leader plays in influencing others. We found that both formal and informal champions and allies are really key in supporting and executing DNI strategy. Again, this may seem sort of a simple concept, but the reality is that many organizations do not necessarily have systems in place to allow for that consistently. And we're also going to discuss in a second how not only finding the champions, but also connecting those champions, you know, that from the poll question, seems like many of you are already doing that, but how that's also key and helps sustainability. So let's get into a little bit more deeper into these two insights. So the first one is about identify champions and allies across the organization. As we've been discussing all throughout this presentation, this may look very different depending on who your stakeholders are and also your resources, right? So if you have an HR team, dedicated team on the ground, it's very different than if you are sort of have to rely on informal people. But both formal and informal roles can help make those priorities meaningful for different regions. They can help inform your strategy about what's working and not working in different regions, and that can ultimately help you make sure that the processes you have in place are effective across regions. So if, you know, the insights that came from our conversations with leaders from different industries, different DNI structures, different DNI staffing, is to really cultivate both formal and informal champions and try to find ways of engaging them in executing the strategy. You know, you see in this picture, this is fairly self-explanatory, but you know, we just released a study on employee resource groups, and many organizations that may not have the strong staffing or resources on the ground were able to use employee resource groups as a resource to really get people on the ground to participate. You know, we'll talk about metrics later, but you know, that's also something that would provide sometimes some measurable things that you can track in terms of how employee resource groups are functioning in different regions and the kind of culture change that you may be seeing as a result of their engagement. So I definitely encourage you to look at rather research in that area too. Also important though, and this is again emerged, you know, as a very key, is not only finding the local champions, but also finding ways for these champions to interact and participate. We heard that there's really a range of ways that organizations can do that. Again, part of it can be resources, your structure, and so on. Having the budget, you know, one way to do that is to find a way to get together on a regular basis and then keep the virtual communication as well. So some companies have global annual conferences. It could be DNI conferences, council conferences, ERG conferences. Others have cross-regional councils that meet on a regular basis. Many have regular virtual meetings. So the reason why these approaches and these strategies are important is because it only, you know, it allows people to really connect and share best practices, share challenges, and this also is important for regions where you may have maybe smaller DNI team, or you may have just one person helping with the strategy, and so this helps create sustainability also for regions and offices that are smaller and where people may not have a lot of support in their work, and so this helps make sure that there's communication, there's consistencies, and also it helps avoid burnout or, you know, what some call diversity fatigue in this area. So this is, again, the connections are finding the champions and then connecting those champions with each other.
Yeah, and I think, thank you, Laura, and I think that, you know, global community is a great strength, but also there is always that potential of chaos or potential of overlap or misunderstandings. And I think someone in the comments, one of our participants has said, you know, the local leader wants to say yes. So something that we also found in our research is that the leaders we interviewed did say that it was important to have that distinction, a clear distinction between the spokes' ownership of the local DNI strategy and their accountability for executing it, and not to let ownership and accountability become rather mixed up. So ownership is about the leaders and others within that local organisation buying into that global DNI strategy and seeing its relevance to the context in which they operated. And that is very much, you know, the groundwork for ownership. But accountability is something different. It's about establishing explicit expectations about what the business divisions and the regions are responsible for delivering. This might include behaviours, like some goals around inclusive leadership. That might be part of your performance management system. It could be metrics for gender representation and other DNI goals around, say, hiring. But the accountabilities really link the expectations of what the local should be doing, how it will contribute towards sort of global strategy overall. And if you can get those two working together, they can really be linked and mutually reinforcing. So obviously under ownership, a compelling, a clear business case is really, really important. I think also the voice of regional representatives and champions is so important because you can give them a really pivotal role in how you're designing and delivering your initiatives and also ensuring that they are receiving the support, the resources that they need to be successful at that local level. When it comes to accountability, I think this is an area that's still developing. Some companies that we interviewed have established accountability through a range of internal and external mechanisms. Sometimes it's key metrics. One company we spoke to is building DNI metrics into the leaders' performance evaluations, particularly compensation. So actually really saying, you know, this is directly linked to your discretionary bonus. We thought overall that we were seeing a focus on soft accountability measures. And, you know, I think, again, it really depends what works in your company. But in addition to these internal measures and accountabilities, some companies were making really great use of external recognition and benchmarks to both, you know, enhance the company reputation, but also to really use those frameworks or those standards as a way of helping the organisation mobilise and to build that internal accountability and ownership. So using some sort of external auditing body can be a really, really effective strategy.
And so we are at our last insight, and hopefully we'll get time to get to the recommendations. So I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. All this information will be available, of course, in the slide, but also in the report that is coming out. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, we ask organizations to tell us about whether they're using particular tools, both to track progress, but also to identify these local trends that we've been talking about, right? So if you have a global organization and you have a map of the world in front of you, how do you manage that all? How do you communicate and speak with the local stakeholders and figure out what approach to use? How do you decide what priorities should be in place in what region? We heard about a variety of different tools across organizations, sometimes within the same organization. And I have to say that many of these tools are consistent with approaches that we heard from other studies on diversity and inclusion. So the figure on the slide shows some of the key elements that we heard, risk assessment, and that's sort of has almost a negative terminology, but it's risk in terms of, okay, what are the hot issues related to diversity and inclusion that emerge in a particular region, you know? So sometimes, as Marion mentioned earlier, there can be a situation where, you know, something needs to happen or there's a critical situation in one region or department or function where there's challenges that need to be addressed right now. And so this risk approach may allow you to identify areas where you really need to figure out your priorities a little sooner rather than later. We heard many organizations using human capital analytics to identify what's working and work in progress. And as a researcher myself, I always highly recommend whenever possible to engage your human capital analytics team to understand how your initiatives are working and to track as much as you can what's happening within your organization. Scenario planning is another way of figuring out what's happening and how your initiatives might go on. So if I were to take a take-home message about this, is really about, you know, you can be creative in figuring out what tools can be used, borrow from other departments, other functions, and really see what can help you manage the complexity and the messiness that we've been discussing here. So one quick example that we heard, and again, this is just an example. Let me go back. You know, it's of how organizations may use a heat map, for example, to understand what's happening within their region. So in this example, an organization maybe wanted to understand how 3 priorities are playing across their countries where they operate. So we have women's representation at VP level. Maybe that's a priority that is key across all regions. We have an inclusion index score. Maybe this organization had a priority about increasing inclusion across regions, and then we have attrition. So just to give an example, if you enter the data where green is or countries that have achieved their goals, yellow is countries that are sort of the border between they're really close to achieving, and maybe the red is countries that have not achieved those goals yet. So these figures gives you a sense of how this may play out, right? So you can see where you may need to focus your effort, but it also tells you about the relationship among these different priorities. So looking at this completely made-up scenario, we can tell, oh, we see that women's representation is related to inclusion. So when that's green, the other is green. When that's red, the other is red or yellow. So having more women in VP roles may impact your inclusion scores overall. However, the two are not necessarily related to attrition. And so in some countries where maybe it's there's not as much job mobility, maybe attrition is not impacted by inclusion and women's representation, but in countries where there are more job opportunities, the three are related. So again, this is just an example based, on hypothetical data, but it shows how you and your global team might be able to use different tools to really understand what's happening across the region.
So conscious of time, I suggest that we skip poll question 10, as I'm sure our audience is really interested in the recommendations.
Yes. Yes, so we've been speaking about recommendations throughout the presentation, so this is probably not going to be new information, but we grouped everything we've been talking about around these different categories, definition standards, local ownership, allyship, tools and measurements. Marianne, anything to add or any concluding thoughts related to our recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, there was a question about how you measure impact, and I think measurement is such an important area. It's such a big area, but I think the thing I'd just like to flag up is that we're also doing some work around diversity reporting, and DNI reporting is becoming really important, and we're getting international frameworks, we're getting regulators starting to require that companies do report, and so having good metrics, having a good way of measuring impact, I think is actually becoming very, very important. And probably there needs to be a lot more work on that. And I think at the moment that companies are doing some very simple measurements, but to tell the story, they're going to have to get a lot better at that.
Yeah, and I would also encourage you, this is a question that has come up in other research. In our employee resource group report that just came out, we actually have some recommendations about how to think about the short-term and long-term impact of employee groups, which can really apply to any diversity and inclusion initiative. So really, let us know if you want us to send you that report. It was just published at the early January, and that has some recommendations around measurements as well.
Yeah, I also see a couple questions regarding metrics. So in December 2018, the conference board also published a report on defining and measuring inclusion. So if you're interested, feel free to check that out. It's available on our website. And sorry, I forgot to mention that this Taking DNI Global report will be released later this month, and you can also access it via our website. And if you have additional questions, feel free to reach out to Marianne, Laura, and me. So thank you so much, Laura and Marianne, today for sharing your insights and also recommendations. I hope our audience find those insights helpful. And thank you for those of you who have been staying online for the entire hour, and hopefully you can have some takeaways from today's webcast. So just very quickly, our next Human Capital Watch will be held on April 25th. The topic is Career Management for What Lies Ahead. I also want to do a shout out of the conference board, Human Capital Benchmarking Service. So we focused on 10 different areas within human capital. And you will receive a copy of the 2020 State of Human Capital Report after completing the survey. And also, if you are one of the first 200 respondents to complete the survey, you will get a free pass to your choice of our upcoming U.S. conferences. So really encourage you to participate in the benchmarking service. We also have a new podcast series called Human Capital Insights, where you can get some latest insights from our recent reports regarding different areas in human capital. So thank you again for participating in today's webcast, and please don't forget to fill out the webcast evaluation after the show. Thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.